Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at chapter 17 of the Mythical Man Month, which is called No Silver Bullet Refired. So if you came to this video right after watching the last one, you have the awesome gift of not having to wait decades to see how that chapter aged. Let's jump into it. The author notes that when the original version of Mythical Man Month was published, it was well received across the board with the exception of that chapter, which generated a lot of rebuttals. And these are some of the ones that he explores and responds to in this chapter. His first rebuttals are to people who he believes misrepresented the original essay and thus went after something that he wasn't originally meaning to assert. But then again, given that the title of the section refers to No Silver Bullet as quote-unquote obscure writing, it seems that he's at least aware enough to know that perhaps he wasn't perfectly clear in the original, and that could be the source of the misunderstanding ultimately. He does, however, make a significant point here in talking about the total effort of creating software as being some portion designing the program construct, and the remaining portion being actually coding it. This distinction is important because the greater the portion of the effort is in the latter, the more there is to be gained in terms of overall productivity arising from more efficient tools, processes, etc. But in reality, the design phase, which exists largely in the mind of the coding programmers, the design phase exists largely in our minds and in communications with others on the team is the heavier, the greater effort of the two. Another critique of No Silver Bullet comes from Steve Lukasik, who writes that complexity of today becomes the order of tomorrow. Since we learn and study more and apply ourselves as individuals and as an industry, things that were too hard to once distill can actually be explained ultimately, as is the case of the physical sciences, which grow and develop over time, and things that were previously unknown become more or less common knowledge. But this isn't entirely applicable to, or this isn't entirely analogous, since there is much more uncertainty in programming than in the natural world. While elements and molecules have the same composition and behave the same way across space and time, software does not, as it is the product of humans' capricious minds. Thus, while there can be tribal knowledge and gains to be had on these lines, to some extent, it is only some extent, and not entirely. The next critique comes from David Harrell, which the author calls the most careful analysis of the original No Silver Bullet that has been written. Harrell takes issue with the gloomy tone of the essay and says that it's overly and unnecessarily pessimistic. Brooks responds that there isn't anything gloomy about the essay, in the same way that science isn't gloomy. It's just observations and theories and hypotheses based on observations. A big distinction in the original and in this rebuttal is around essence and accident. By these we mean what portion of time is spent constructing the intended outcome and what portion of time is spent contending with happenstance along the way, such as bugs and so on. Those are the two of essence and accident. David Harrell proposes a thought experiment where the assertion of No Silver Bullet are taken back, the assertions of No Silver Bullet are taken back to an earlier decade, the 1950s, and then shows that given the progression in those ensuing decades, the main point of No Silver Bullet is invalid. This is absurd, Brooks writes, on the basis that the ratio of essence time to accident time has increased dramatically in the time since then, and thus while productivity gains of that magnitude were possible back then, this doesn't continue to be true into the future since essence-related tasks take a much higher portion of the time than they used to. So with these rebuttals and counter rebuttals in mind, what has actually happened? Has the original essay turned out to be true, to be proven false, or perhaps somewhere in between? It seems like the answer is ultimately true, but perhaps more in the middle if we take a more nuanced view. There have been dramatic productivity improvements, but from another place other than a big step up of worker efficiency on its own, either from a silver bullet or otherwise. And this is what it is. The huge boost that we have gotten over time has been the proliferation of more and more specialized software, which is available to purchase or for free in the case of open source software, and which can be orchestrated with each other so that any given team can spend more time and energy focusing almost exclusively on the differentiation for their one specific application. The next section is called Object-Oriented Programming. Will a Brass Bullet Do? It's a clever title because it reflects that OOP has been immensely helpful, but not all at once or even quickly. It takes time for the industry to change paradigms, and even up to now, it isn't a given that OOP is the right choice for all situations. So there is still a discernment necessary in that decision. Finally, the author shares thoughts on reuse of software and says that the best way to attack the essence of building programs is to not build it at all. If you're spared building some programs because you bought it from elsewhere, and reused a lot of other functionality because it was able to be shared via inheritance or modules, as is often the case with OOP, then you're saving yourself and your team huge amounts of mental effort because you're simply building on elements that already exist. As a result, there are still no silver bullets all these decades later, but there is a lot of incremental productivity gains to be had, and which we are having and will continue to have, even more so as time goes on. So that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it thought-provoking, and I'll see you all in the next one.